Welcome. Thank you for joining our Manufacturing Practice Best Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Larry Isaacson, our USDM practice leader, will be presenting. The discussion today will be covering introductions, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, the new compliance challenge for nutraceutical manufacturers. The USDM team is proud to have Larry in a leadership role. He offers 20 years in the application of GXP compliant IT technology in life sciences organizations. Larry has experience in manufacturing, software development, and clinical and laboratory contract service management environments. He recently led the implementation and validation of FDA-regulated global ERP, laboratory, and quality management systems. He has experience in establishing IT and quality strategy projects and change management programs. Larry has held the position of Director of IT in pharma, biotech, and medical device company, and he holds an MS in pharmaceutical research sciences. USDM is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory IT compliance professional service solutions. Our various dedicated practices include PLM, ERP, CRM, GRC, ECM, and clinical and drug safety. We're the compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Agilent, OpenText, Oracle, and SAP. We're headquartered in Ventura, and we've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients. We offer hands-on experience assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're the market leader for validation accelerator packs. The content will be covered in 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board on the lower left of your screen, or you can join the discussion on LinkedIn and post questions there. I'm happy to address questions for you offline as well. My contact information will be provided at the end of today's session. Thanks again for joining us, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Larry.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for joining. Today we're going to cover a very important topic, which is really a landmark in the history of FDA regulation in this area of both pharmaceutical food and foods, and really is from a QA perspective, for those of us in the QA area for regulated systems, is a natural progression of what we've seen over the last 20 years of pretty fundamental QA principles being applied more and more broadly within the different domains of manufacturing. The extension of this now to dietary supplements settles quite a bit of controversy that has been raging over the years, and we'll touch on that. So we'll touch on the history of dietary supplement regulation and how it led to this current new era, effectively, in dietary supplement manufacturing. And that's basically within the Part 111 section of CFR 21, and we're going to compare that a little bit to the Part 110, which was the food manufacturing GMPs, and there was quite a bit of difference there to address. One of the big implications of this is that there are new requirements for electronic records, and we'll touch on that, and has big impacts on how you use computer systems and deploy them, with substantial new disciplines being required within both the QC realm as well as within the business. And then we'll summarize the implications of that. So dietary supplement regulation goes back to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 with its various amendments along the way. There's always been a tug of war between the FDA and various industries about how much regulation is appropriate, And with this act, it was the first time they tried to address all the chemical entities pretty much within the marketplace, especially medical entities. However, they also wanted to address certain food entities because claims were being made about the benefits of foods and dietary supplements, effectively, which were subparts of foods. And so this act effectively defined dietary supplements within the food realm and enforced claims of potency and other types of claims for drugs especially, but also for foods. And it started the sort of tug of war that about whether foods, additives, and dietary supplements were considered drugs. And the FDA did take steps to start regulating them as drugs, requiring pre-approvals of some of these compounds. And over the next 20 or so years, there were some congressional actions and amendments to the FD&C to try to limit that on behalf of the industry. And this continued to 1990 with the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, because as dietary supplements continued to become a larger and larger part of the market and more diverse, there was concern that there wasn't a lot of education about how to use them and what's in them. So this affected labeling, especially in various types of health claims. But before it was actually enacted fully, it was overshadowed by a Drug Safety Act, which was also put in later in 1992, which actually put a limitation on the NLEA's implementation for a year. So there's been a lot of confusion and fighting over these definitions of what's a food supplement and how much regulation is required, and whether it's a food additive. And that all culminated in the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of '94, which is really the landmark legislation that has created the foundation for all that's come after that. Some of the key distinctions that were made there, which settled a lot of the historical issues, was that they defined dietary supplements as distinct from food additives. There were some exceptions for herbals and botanicals, and some of those were grandfathered in, and there's a lot of details about that we won't go into here. But the significance of that was that foods typically have been considered safe unless proved otherwise, and there are many provisions around that, primarily related to microbial contamination and adulteration. But compared to a food additive and a drug, which required pre-approval, it really limited substantially the amount of regulation that was required for dietary supplements compared to other entities. It really focused on establishing safety and labeling standards for dietary supplements and some limitations and allowances for health claims. And then new dietary ingredients that were not previously in the food supply were required to get pre-approval. So that was one of the trade-offs there. And so manufacturers do their best to demonstrate that whatever they're using is not new to the food chain as a result. Now, the key is the burden of proof is on the government for safety. And so it's a lower standard than a drug or a food additive. So the trade-off for that was that it enabled the promulgation of good manufacturing practices. While it's still treated as a food initially under Part 110 at the time, over a period of time culminating in 2007, proposed GMPs were put out in 2003 with input from the industry, and then this was actually finalized in 2007 after quite a few rewrites. And as a result, these CGMPs, which are new for dietary supplements and are specific to that area as they are defined, as not being a meal replacement, but as a supplement to meals, is much more comprehensive than 110. Some dietary supplements can effectively be foods like juices and liquids of various kinds, but have to be very clearly indicated as not being a substitute for a regular nutritional meal. And what you find is that the principles, philosophies, and approaches that were used for pharmaceuticals in Part 210 and 211 were nearly completely transferred into 111, which is basically foundational for what good GMP is. And so the foundation for safety in this area is now demonstrating that the specifications that are defined for what a dietary supplement is meant to be is actually implemented accurately through these GMPs and can be verified. So when you look at the operational impact of these of 111 versus 110, while in many cases the same subject matter is addressed, and in many cases there's also additional ones that were never addressed in 110, they're much more extensive. If you start with laboratory controls, which is actually the first part of this act, there are extensive specific controls about how you run a laboratory, the procedures requiring to exist, the standards in testing and demonstration of the test accuracy that is involved, and that is really a part of the QC function, which is very important to the whole process. Sorry about that. And then there are manufacturing operation controls, which are quite extensive. And while these existed in Part 110, this is much more specific now, especially in terms of batch records and master batch records. We'll touch a little more on that. The same with packaging and labeling controls. When you look at these areas, they're literally lifted right out of the pharmaceutical with some minor changes to address basically the same control points in terms of the ability to characterize all of your packaging and as it's incoming to inspect it and demonstrate that it's consistent with what your specification is. Holding and distribution controls are much more extensive than in 110, related to retaining samples and how you hold product, not just from a microbial and lack of adulteration perspective, which is what 110 focused on, but going in terms of being able to assure that things are not being mixed up, as is the term that's used in the regulation, which has many implications as to how you manage product through the supply chain. The same goes for handling of returns and salvage product, which often wasn't addressed in 110 at all, and which is more appropriate for dietary supplements since that does occur, and there is product and defects and deviations to be dealt with, and that is very specifically indicated. Product complaints, customer complaints are specifically called out for how they're supposed to be handled and mitigated by QC. Extensive record keeping is prescribed for each of these areas we're discussing, as well as a separate section. And deviation management in terms of if there is a problem with a procedure or you find that there is something that's out of spec, there's a lot of specific documentation and processes that need to be in place to deal with those. In addition to the procedures around how you operate, there's training documentation. And while this did exist in 110, it was very general and not nearly as specific as the demonstration of the training that it has in accordance with the regulation. Product history and traceability is also relatively new compared to 110, being able to demonstrate that where the product came from in terms of the ingredients, and how it was incorporated into a product and its intermediates, and traceability to the shipping process and through the shipping process to be able to recall if necessary. And quality control, role and authority is a very big area in this area, but virtually identical to what you see in pharmaceuticals now. And while it doesn't necessarily have to be a distinct unit, unlike the pharmaceutical regulations, all of the requirements and responsibilities are pretty much identical. And in effect, you're going to have that in place in most cases. And of some great significance is the fact that the FDA has the right to come and review these records at any time in an audit. And while there was controversy as to whether in some cases FDA actually had the right to do that, it's been pretty much accepted that that is the case, and they are conducting audits as we speak. So hence the moniker nutraceutical is much more applicable these days with this type of regulation, because for all intents and purposes you are going to be evolving to manage the operation much like a pharmaceutical house or medical device house typically does. So when you turn to record keeping, which is ultimately at the heart of what we're trying to address here, in addition to all of the changes that have to occur in the much more high resolution activity, that is needed to track all the activities in manufacturing and shipping and the like in laboratories. In the end, you're judged on your recording of those activities, because when the auditor comes to call, the only way you can really prove effectively that you, besides an inspection of the facility, of course, and a walkthrough, is the recording of the activities demonstrating that you're adhering to your procedures, that you are adhering to your specifications. So there are quite a few new records required to be kept, explicitly and implicitly, in order for you to demonstrate this traceability and other requirements. So this documentation, it falls into a few categories. Procedures stops the list in many respects, because without procedures, it's difficult to be able to demonstrate what you're complying with. So it all starts with that. Those procedures have to be obviously specifically tailored to, meeting the regulations and what's expected in each of these operations. And the training of the people in these procedures, not to mention in general, manufacturing operations and laboratory operations capabilities and background, is very critical. And as these procedures change, as you change your product, as you bring a new product, as organizations morph into larger and different organizations, these procedures need to evolve with the organization. In addition, you'll have much more supplier data and purchasing data to be able to demonstrate the ingredient sources, their sufficiency, and their adherence to the specifications you've indicated. While it's not quite as rigorous as in the pharmaceuticals area, there have been some recent legislation proposed but not acted on by Senator McCain, notably, which are basically pushing on those remaining areas that are differentiating it from pharmaceutical regulation in terms of being able to having to do supplier audits and testing everything that comes in the door more rigorously. So I think that's coming down the road. The pressure is still on for additional requirements. Obviously, master and lot batch records are a major new component to some degree in terms of the level of resolution required, the extent to which you have to be able to manage the creation of those records and the demonstration that you're, for each batch, that you're adhering to that and that the specification is met for each batch, and subsequently how you handle the batches and the intermediates associated with it. The more complex your operation of your product, the more difficult this becomes to do manually. Laboratory data, as we discussed, is a core to this in terms of being able to demonstrate that your QC methods are appropriate, and all your data that you capture and the samples going in for each batch and for ingredients that you might test and for a finished product is accurate, and it does demonstrate, in fact, what you're trying to show. And handling of deviations. In an audit, no one expects that you're not going to have deviations, you're not going to have mistakes made, you're not going to have product that's sometimes out of spec. But how you handle that needs to be very explicitly defined. And so that's usually what an auditor is going to go after immediately is, well, what deviations did you have? Let's see how you handled it, and how did you meet your SOPs to tell us how you're expected to handle it. And if you do that, you're going to pass with flying colors. They most importantly want to see that you are being able to manage deviations so that you're not out of control effectively, and nothing gets through. Inventory movement is a very, very important part of this, because not being able to allow mix-ups, making sure that the proper labeling is on ingredients and batches, and as you move it through quarantine, from quarantine to release in various stages, which is also a new requirement that's implicit in these regulations, that is all under control and demonstrable. And this is, again, a high degree of resolution required to be able to have traceability through your facility and to the from input and output. Associated with all of this implicitly is change management. As things are changing, as your product changes, as your master batch record changes, these have to be propagated appropriately to all the areas that are the control points for making sure this, effectively shows up in the product, and that everybody is aware of it and training has occurred. And of course, in order to demonstrate all this, you have to be able to report on it accurately. So the reports that you use for control and review of your activities and that you're going to show to the FDA have to be accurate, and they have to be representative of what is really going on. And this is just the high points. There are some others we could talk about, but we have too limited amount of time. So the end result of all this is it pushes companies, both in the dietary supplement area as well as historically in pharmaceuticals and medical device, into use of real-time electronic systems in order to handle what is probably an order of magnitude increase in the record keeping required and the extent to which you have to be ready to use that in real time. It's virtually impossible to do cost effectively by just adding people and trying to manage paper more effectively. Real-time electronic systems are available to be able to enable this with much less increase in cost and actually much higher levels of quality being achieved and certainty about what's going on for management purposes. So one of the biggest things about this new regulation about records is that while it doesn't require you to use computer systems to meet any of those requirements, you can use manual or electronic means and have those records in paper form for review by the FDA. It does specify in subpart P with this one sentence that all electronic records must comply with Part 11 of this chapter, which is CFR 21. Now, with that one sentence, they pull in, for purposes of using computer systems to control your operation, a substantial set of requirements that go along with managing the computer systems and their deployment and utilization on an ongoing basis. The computer systems are basically now considered a part of your manufacturing operation, and the same controls and demonstrations you have to use to demonstrate your manufacturing operation is in control, along with distribution and laboratories as well, is applied to your IT function to the extent that it is supporting these regulated environments. So what Part 11 does is it specifies the definition of what a regulated computer system is and the controls and requirements for using a computer system to capture this regulated data electronically so that it can be used to support compliance, not to mention your operational needs. For any predicate rule, which is an example, Part 111 or 211 in 21 CFR. So Part 11 applies to a number of areas, most recently now to 111. Notably, it wasn't in the original 2003 proposed rulemaking, but it was added since Part 11 became much more prevalent when it was finalized. So that's not insignificant. So generally, the takeaway here is if your computer system that you're using today or you're going to deploy later captures data with no paper intermediate, such that you would say, oh, my paper is my actual data and I sign and date all my transactions and my reviews from QC on paper, and that's what you're going to look at. If you're not able to do that because you're really using the computer system as your primary method of transactions and documentation, then it's being used to support your operation and decision-making related to the processes governed by the regulation, by definition, whether that's a laboratory, whether that's your manufacturing or distribution. And it, by definition, that has to comply with Part 11 because you have to demonstrate the sufficiency of that computer system to meet this requirement. So what is Part 11 comprised of? Fundamentally, these computer systems come as effectively kits. They're toolkits. Today they come with substantial amounts of configuration that are designed to be tailored to your specific purpose, your business. While they may be from a subject matter domain area, they might be a laboratory system or a manufacturing control system. They're completely configurable to your specific set of requirements and how you operate. So you have to demonstrate that that system, as it's configured and deployed at your location, complies with a set of approved requirements, within a framework that we're going to discuss soon. And these requirements basically are verified and validated effectively to show that this computer system is meeting those requirements. So you have defined up front what requirements define your business effectively, distinct from others. You also have to define what demonstrate security of the data that you've collected. It can't be changed after the fact by anybody inappropriately or without an audit trail, and that we know who is doing those transactions without uncertainty. It's just like you would on a piece of paper where someone is doing their initials and dating. You have handwriting. You can demonstrate, or probably demonstrate in an audit who did something or find out who did. In a computer system, it's much more difficult unless you've established a framework for that user ID and who's putting that data into the system. So by the same token, you need an electronic signature definition and account management, which demonstrates that every user ID and password is unique within the facility and is controlled such that people aren't using each other's passwords and using each other's accounts, and you really can't trace back any particular transaction or data to the person who originated it. So that's the attributability and non-repudiation type of requirement of Part 11. And then, of course, along with this is change control requirements for the computer system itself, since the computer system becomes effectively an essential part of your manufacturing operation, and it basically has to be under control and demonstrated that if any changes are made to it, that it has not affected the quality of the product and its specifications and your ability to manage that product, and that the people who are managing the computer system and using it have been trained to whatever changes you've implemented, and that everybody's approved it effectively throughout who are going to be affected by it. So those are there are many others, but these are the core ones that have to be demonstrated and people are going to be looking for in an audit. So what this yields is the need to be able to verify that computer system is working appropriately. And you look at your computer systems typically, and this is just IT practice, within a system lifecycle framework. We know earlier that you have every system starts with a requirement, and it moves on through a design phase of some kind, and then you have building and development and testing, and at a technical level, then you have user acceptance testing, and then it enters a maintenance mode where you're using the system for a period of time, and you're changing the system during that period to meet business needs and to, as the vendor changes the hardware and the software you need to keep it running. And eventually it's supplanted in retirement, and there's a whole bunch of data in there that needs to be managed that may be important because you have retention requirements for 3 years after the expiration date of a product. That you may have to be audited on that, and if there was an issue or such as a recall, you may have to demonstrate that that data was basically needed for an audit. You have to have it available, so that's a consideration of how you do that. So this all starts, as I said earlier, with requirements and specifications, and that takes time up front to identify what is it I'm trying to do with this computer system, how am I going to use it. Both business and technical groups are input to that. And that is usually compiled into what is called the user requirement specification, a functional specification, and a design specification. Those are broadly the requirements. And those are approved by QA, QC, and the business and IT usually. And there's subsequently a design, which is a document that is created as well as part of the design document, if appropriate. It may not be necessary in all cases. You configure it and deploy it, ready for deployment, and then there is a rigorous acceptance testing process. This process is defined by standards called GAMP, which are generally accepted manufacturing practices of pharmaceutical companies in the past, and now are completely applicable to dietary supplements because it's the same basic process being utilized to demonstrate that you're meeting these types of Part 11 requirements for computer system subject to these areas. And IQ is an installation qualification, and OQ is an operational qualification, a PQ is a performance qualification. The IQ demonstrates it's installed properly. The OQ shows that every function you might use in the system is performing appropriately. And the PQ is an end-to-end test. So as an example, in an ERP system, you may show an set of ingredients comes in. They move from quarantine to release. They're used in a manufacturing process. The finished product is then moved to a release status after testing, and then is ready for shipment and can be shipped. So you'll demonstrate that process in a PQ end to end. And it depends, of course, on the preliminary testing and the OQ. So that's the thinking that goes in there. In order to establish the framework for this and the validation that you just described is really a point in time that's demonstrating that we've shown that this system is able to do what we said it was going to do. It's going to support our business in a compliant manner and be under control as we use it. But that's only establishing that at that point in time it is in place. In order to maintain that over time and demonstrate that, you need typically a quality management system, which is what your QC or QA department would be administering. This quality management system is the hub of the wheel of the main activities and tracking that goes on to demonstrate the whole operation is maintaining compliance with the GMPs to the extent that computer systems are being used to manage them. The quality management system can have many different parts and segments. There's a computer system specific part, and then there's just the operational part, often supported by specialized computer systems. So your corrective and preventative actions deal with deviations, your equipment and process controls and calibration. There's a huge area about calibration in the regulation about how you manage equipment. Your material handling, your laboratory systems, your production system, and facilities all are controlled by this quality management system, and the foundation for that is extensive procedures that are written to cover all of these areas and are the foundation for demonstrating the quality that the quality management system is meant to ensure. So what are the components of a quality system in general? And there's quite a few of them, and these are the high points. A document repository with controlled versions and central authority for all regulated records. So, as you may already have to some degree, you've got to control your documents that are demonstrating what you're currently doing in your facility and your procedures. And there's a document control function associated with that, with specific versioning of documents so that you know you're using the latest one at any one time and can demonstrate whatever was done with this manufacturing process. I did use the latest approved procedures and my people were trained on it. You've got management of the operational procedures of business and IT managed under this document control system. So given you have this document repository and a way to check documents in, check them out, get them approved, and issue them for use and train people on them, then the scope of that basically is across the board in terms of your operation. And that's very specifically indicated in the regulations. The training records associated with these procedures and other operations, all the operations associated with procedures, is how you show that your people are qualified to do their job. You've got a change control system of some kind that formally addresses changes, documents their assessment, and their approval of the change and how it's been managed and implemented into the facility or the system for systems, equipment, procedures, product, and raw materials, to name a few. And the laboratory has some of its own specific requirements. Quality control and trend data, obviously you have to be able to report that on a pretty detailed basis. You've got a deviation tracking and resolution records as a result of this quality system's activities related to deviations, which is a very, very, very hot button with the FDA, as we said. You have to have defined policies and procedures and the training regarding the implementation and use of a quality system. So typically all your employees are aware of the quality system, how they're being judged in terms of requirements to adhere to SOPs. Penalties for not adhering to SOPs are usually in place. And a deviation, if someone doesn't use the right SOP or follow it, is usually has to be logged, and that's got to be available for inspection. Now, as we said, while it's not required to be computerized, practicality tends to dictate that your ROI be best served using packaged systems for this. And there's a whole range of packaged systems. You'll see that on our website that we're going to be laying out for the dietary supplement nutraceutical area that can match up against each of these key new regulations in 111. And the electronic quality management system, which there are many packages to help you handle that, is usually owned by the QA and QC unit, and is a separate system that itself needs to be validated, but can make everybody's life a lot easier to manage all of these components we just talked about. So in summary, as you can see, Part 111 brings enormous changes to compliance and documentation requirements for this area of nutraceutical dietary supplement manufacturers and distributors, and probably ultimately to suppliers when they keep pushing back up the supply chain, which it seems they're going to do. The increased use of packaged software systems that have been established to be able to allow compliance would substantially ease the maintenance of compliance and improve audit results for the dietary supplement industry. And many of you are probably already using ERP systems. The likelihood is that you're not using them in the controlled, rigorous manner of testing and deployment and ongoing change control in terms of its documentation that typically 111 would expect you to be using. So many of the companies we talk to are basically having to move maybe using systems, but are now moving them into this compliance state to demonstrate the control of these systems, and that requires a lot of new disciplines. And that's what we're talking about here. Your standards for demonstrating fitness and operation of these systems for use to the FDA is required to be met. And that's the key, is that there are various levels of compliance you can achieve, and you can choose to take a low-risk or a high-risk approach to the extent that you decide to comply or to document or trace things through your operation. But the difficulty comes when the FDA asks very simple questions in an audit. So you say, well, how do you know this was properly handled? How do you know where that went? Very simple questions can create a lot of confusion in an audit if the records are not readily available and there isn't clarity as to how you would demonstrate certain compliance aspects. So that's the situation we help people avoid. You only have so much time to respond to these questions, and you want to be able to do it immediately with no uncertainty. So this is where we come in as an experienced validation consulting firm. Most companies in any domain tend to need some help to migrate into this new culture of compliance. Even new pharmaceutical companies moving from the research and development stage to the production stage have to make this transition. So we help companies all the time come up the maturity curve from a compliance standpoint in terms of how they use their systems and even how they handle their operations and their IT organization structure and operation. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Becky for questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Larry. Great information there. I appreciate you sharing that. We will open the floor to questions now, and to give you a moment just to type those in, I'd let you know that the webinar has been recorded and will be available on our website, which is, of course, usdatamanagement.com. I see our first question is from John. He's asking, how do I know if a computer system I am using in my operation is required to be validated or comply with Part 11?
Yeah, well, that's of course the critical question, and there's obviously certain types of controversy around that. As I mentioned in the webinar itself, you have to be cognizant of a few of the key criteria for that, and one of them is that if you're depending upon that system for any of the operations that are critical to the demonstration of compliance that are in the regulations. So as an example, in your laboratory, if you are using analytical instruments to demonstrate the adherence to specifications for an ingredient or for an intermediate or your finished product, then you are required, even for an analytical instrument that has a computer system attached to it, to have validated to some degree the information system that is either baked into that instrument to deliver its output or attached to it as a third-party application. Now, if that system is well characterized enough so that you can say, well, I'm just checking everything 100%, and the paper output that I've checked 100% or double checked through dual data logging of some kind is demonstrated to be accurate, then you can make that case to the FDA but more and more it's going to be difficult given the requirements for calibration that they have in the regulations to be able to make that case effectively. And what we've seen as an example of our pharmaceutical business is that early on people were given some leeway if they were able to demonstrate mitigating factors. But more and more they'll push and push and push and still note the finding and recommendation that you move to an electronic system to better handle and demonstrate compliance. So it's going to be a pay me now, pay me later scenario. And for ERP systems, as an example, to the extent that you are not able to resort to paper to demonstrate your compliance in all the areas that we're talking about, then you're likely to have to be able to validate that system. And what's difficult is that you often have this piecemeal approach. You may have a system that is being used exclusively without paper, and then another one where you are printing things out and it's part of the overall matrix of your operation. Some are automated, some are not. Well, you may have paper that you can demonstrate to the FDA certain pieces because you're doing it manually, logging everything manually, doing initials and dating from the very get-go, and that's how you're capturing the data. But if you're using a computer systems to primarily capture it in the first instance and then printing out and using that as in a review process, it's harder to make that case. So there's some gray areas, but you typically in an audit don't want to be sitting there trying to explain to the FDA why this is really not subject to validation. You just typically don't want to go there if you can avoid it.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, and next question is from Sue. She is asking, how is validation testing different than the normal user acceptance testing we've always done?
Yeah, and especially from an IT perspective, it's been very common with any kind of IT methodology where there is a couple of phases to a test of any computer system. And that's usually the first technical test where IT itself has a set of tests that it does of its own systems to make sure that it's working according to their specification. As an example, the functional or design spec that was utilized early on. And hopefully you have those. If not, you've got some other issues that will certainly be affected by the requirements of the Part 11. But assuming you have those, there's always been a technical testing process. And then usually you turn around and present that to the user, and they do their testing. And there could be a certain level of informality depending on the culture of your company in that regard, or it could be much more formal if you follow some of the COBIT and IT standards where you are doing a formal script and you're signing it off, the business signs it off. What's very different is that, number one, if it's a validated system, there are standards that are associated with regulated systems that people are generally recognized as required to be met, as I laid out briefly in the talk, that are expected to the extent that there are sign-offs, formal sign-offs before the testing occurs. There are scripts, formal scripts, and most importantly, that your QC or QA department is approving everything. And that's what you'll see in the regulations in general, is before even areas where under the food regulations there were required to be controls and documentation, you didn't necessarily have to have your QC department overseeing everything. You just had to show that they existed within the business. Now, effectively, QC has to be a part of everything. They have to pre-approve things and they have to post-approve them. And that's a big, big difference and creates a lot more complexity in the process and more perspectives for what that criteria is for approval.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, those of you that are posting, thank you for the presentation. We do appreciate seeing that. Thank you again. Looks like we have one last question, and it is from Jeff. He's asking, what does the FDA do when they inspect a computer system under this Part 11 regulation?
Well, typically, if you haven't been through this type of FDA audit, from what we've actually been reviewing some of the FDA audit reports that have started coming out of the implementation of 111. And while to a significant degree they're still focusing on adherence to the specifications and labeling and adulteration and things of that nature, they have started to cite people for equipment maintenance and calibration and things like that. And to a lesser degree, computer systems, often because they haven't been using computer systems yet for their operation. But typically what we've seen is, to the extent that a system is being used, they're going to be looking for the controls associated with the computer system. First, they'll look to see if the fundamentals are being done, if you're backing up the system, if you have records associated with the help desk that are called for in terms of incidents or deviations. And most likely, if you have a problem manufacturing or in the laboratory, they're going to trace back to the computer system to determine if the computer system was being managed appropriately to the extent that it participated in or is being used to document the records associated with that incident. And that's what you'll see in general, is that the FDA is very much focused on starting with what went wrong, what was exceptional, then how it was handled, and then they'll do some sampling of typical operations, changes that have been made through the change control system, and incidents that are reported to the help desk. So they'll come at the systems that way. And then they'll look for all of the traceability of the actual incident or the record. Then they'll often look at security. So one of the biggest issues is to make sure that people who are using the system are all properly authorized, that management's managing that process, and that the IT group is managing the administration of those accounts from an electronic signature standpoint appropriately. So those are the high points of what the FDA is going to look at, because those are litmus tests to see if everything else might be in. Typically, you'll see the FDA only has so much time. They're looking for key indicators to indicate whether management's seriously taking these regulations into account and actually applying these principles across the board. And if it starts seeing holes, it's going to dig deeper to see how deep it goes.
I see. Great, Larry. Okay, you know what? Jennifer typed in a quick question, so if you don't mind, we'll sneak in one more, asking, where do I start if I have not validated my systems yet?
Well, the first thing to do is an assessment, and we do this all the time. This is the start of the process, is to do a risk assessment. One of the things I forgot to mention is that all of this is based on an assessment of risk. You look at your operation, you determine where to what degree is the criticality of your operation in terms of its complexity and where you're using computer systems and how they're being used, and the level of the extent of risk associated with the product and its manufacture. And you then determine what's the gap between what your ideal state would be to demonstrate compliance and where you are today. So that's what we do all the time, and then we prioritize which systems need to be brought under control first. You can't boil the ocean in these cases. Usually there's a lot to go on. But the other side is also establishing a quality control group or system so that there's a framework demonstrable to the FDA that you have, so that you can bring these things under control and you can establish procedures and you can do validation testing in the first place. Without that, there's no chance of being able to comply. If everything is ad hoc, that you've got real problems, there's no policies associated with quality, then that's the place to start.
Terrific. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be available on our website, again, usdatamanagement.com. I'd encourage you to take a look there and review our upcoming webinars, as well as recorded sessions of today's presentation, as well as previously recorded topics. We would invite you also to join our LinkedIn forum. There's a discussion group there on LinkedIn, and we'd welcome your insight and feedback and any suggestion for future topics, any pain points that we can help you address. If you did appreciate today's webinar, please let us know by clicking on the like button for our USDM LinkedIn group page, or even better, post a comment. Might take you just a few seconds, but it would mean the world to us. In 2012, this is a very important indicator that our management team is looking at and using as a basis to continue to fund this complimentary series. Thanks for taking the time to help us there. Thank you, Larry, for presenting, and thanks to all of our attendees today. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to team with you in working towards excellence and compliance. Have a wonderful day.